Hello everybody. Today I'd like to talk about names and titles. Now, names and titles are important today, we certainly recognize that, but they were even more important back in the first century. Names were who you were, names were your status, names were your reputation, and it was very important to protect your reputation. The first century in many ways was much more biased and stereotyped than we are today. And the idea was that if you knew someone's name, where they were from and who their father was, you pretty much knew everything you needed to know about them. Think about the way they describe Jesus as saying nothing good ever comes out of Nazareth. And Jesus is always under a little bit of a cloud as far as his reputation is concerned, because there's these rumors about who his father really is. Is it Joseph? Is it God? And that always kind of hangs over Jesus as a cloud. So pay attention to names as you go through Mark. They're very, very important, and they're one of the devices that Mark uses to teach us some theology as he goes through the gospel. Because the names are not just names, they're also titles and status indicators. And in the first century, you did have to be very careful. If someone called you a name, a good or bad name, and you let them do it, then it was in essence saying, yes, I agree with what you're saying. So if they called you a good name, like good teacher, where they call Jesus good teacher in the Gospels, and you let that name stick, then you are expected to live up to the standards of whatever it means to be a good teacher. And that might be why Jesus is very careful to say, don't call me good, no one is good except God. Because in that case, what they're really trying to do is set Jesus up on a pedestal just so they can cut the feet out from underneath him. So in other words, if I allowed you, the students, to call me good teacher, and I go, yeah, that's about right, I'm a pretty good teacher. And then you said, oh, good teacher, let me ask you a question. And you asked me a question about the Bible that I couldn't answer, then I would look like a fool, and you would look like you were smarter maybe than me. So I would be cut down a peg. I would be shamed publicly. So people are very, very careful about allowing someone to call them a name. Sometimes you see Jesus in the naming section with Peter. He says, "Who do you say I am?" And Peter says, "You are the Christ." And Jesus says, "Yes, you're correct, but don't call me that." So he's saying, yes, you're right about that, but don't call me that. I can't let you assign that title to me. Instead, call me the Son of Man. So watch how these titles go. I wrote down just a couple of them just as we encounter them at the beginning of Mark. Certainly we see the name Jesus, which is the name his mother called him, so that's kind of the name people knew him by. But he's also called the Christ, which is very, very significant because Christ is the Greek form of Messiah, which comes from the Old Testament, and it carries very heavily weighted theological connotations. So Israel in the first century AD was desperate for a Messiah, and they were looking for someone like David who would come back and rescue them from the Romans, who would lead them to military rule. So Jesus is very careful about being called the Messiah. He's also very careful about being called Son of God. Watch it. Mark does not use it very often because, again, very theologically loaded. And if you claim to be the Son of God, you're going to demand attention. And we don't see Jesus demanding attention in the Gospel of Mark. We see Jesus performing miracles to indicate what the kingdom of God is like. We see Jesus preaching about the kingdom of God. But the claims, he doesn't force people to believe in him in the Gospels. So we see Jesus' preferred titles in all the Gospels as Son of Man. And that's what he tells Peter to call him when Peter has called him the Christ. And the Son of Man is, again, theologically loaded, but it's a little bit more ambiguous. If you look in the Old Testament, one like the Son of Man will receive dominion from God over everything. So it can be very, very powerful, but it can also be just a man. Very often the book of book of Jeremiah, you see Jeremiah referring to himself as the Son of Man. So Son of Man can be just a guy, just someone born. So it's a more ambiguous title, and it forces people to think. All right, if Jesus calls himself the Son of God, not too much ambiguity about that. If he calls himself the Son of Man, I've got to think, and I've got to look, and I've got to decide. So we also see Jesus called the beloved Son of God. Very, very powerful claim there. And the demons often recognize Jesus and call him the Holy One of God. So watch these titles as you go through. Watch whether it's a positive title and Jesus accepts it or rejects it. And watch if it's a negative title. They call him demon-possessed. They call him crazy in some parts. They say that his father is Satan. And watch how Jesus either accepts or denies these titles, and how that gives us more insight into the theology behind the Gospel of Mark. So, be aware of names and titles. Be on the lookout for them. If you find a good one, share it with us in the group forums. Until next time, bye-bye.